I dealt with this question in both books, in Last Child and in The Nature Principle, because it's a tough question. As you know, it's one of the reasons why they're, even more important, is where the money comes from for research. But one of the reasons that the research hasn't been done to the extent is that science has a hard time with the definition of nature. I worked with some neuroscientists for a couple of years who were experts on the construction of brain architecture in young children. And I would ask them, now you're doing all these experiments to figure out what stresses, what inhibits the construction of brain architecture, reshapes it, et cetera. You look at child care, you look at parent attachment. Have you ever looked at how the natural world helps shape brain architecture in young children? And they would look at me with a blank face and say, well, what's nature? And I would say to the neuroscientists, well, this isn't brain surgery. I don't know, come up with something, 158 trees per acre. The irony was that they were already doing this in the lab. They were creating a control group that they thought was a more natural setting to compare the stressed out pigeons, et cetera, with. So they already were doing it in the lab, but the minute you asked them to step out of the lab, they were just, they couldn't deal with that. So this definition of nature is tough. There's no accident we've left that definition pretty much up to the poets. I think my personal definition is anywhere that I am in some kind of relationship of meaning with species other than my own. That can be my backyard. Sure, a backyard garden absolutely can be nature. I finally met Michael Pollan last year and had lunch with him. And he's the guy who wrote Botany of Desire. And when dining with Michael Pollan, order what Michael Pollan ordered. A wonderful guy. We spent about 2 hours talking, and most of it was complaining about publishing. But we came to this interesting conclusion, is that everyone comes to nature from different directions, nature with a big N. I came to it through my woods behind our house. He came through it through his garden in his backyard because the woods made him nervous. We both came to the same place. That to me is the new nature movement. Whether you come from an urban neighborhood or a farm or like you did from the mountains, communing with bears, et cetera, we all come to this thing we call nature from a different place, but it's, we know it when we see it.
My very first memory from childhood was when I was 4 years old, and it was in Vancouver. We were buying a tent to go camping. And throughout my childhood, thanks to my father, we spent a lot of time camping and fishing. Now, when World War II broke out, we were shipped into the Rocky Mountains to what was called a ghost town, an abandoned town from the silver mines in the 1890s. And we were incarcerated in this remote place. It's a place now that is Valhalla Provincial Park. Now, the problem in where I was staying was that almost all of the other kids my age had parents who had come from Japan. So they were fluently bilingual. My mom and dad only spoke English at home. I couldn't understand a word of Japanese. So they would beat me up all the time. So I grew up, my first case of discrimination against me, but I hated those Japanese kids. The result was I was a loner and spent a lot of time in the mountains. And in the mountains, I encountered wolves, I encountered bears, I encountered, I was fishing all the time as well. We'd go picking mushrooms. So that really, and I discovered a lot of things there. You know that if you want to use grasshoppers for bait, which are fantastic, the best thing is to go when it's still cool in the morning, when the dew's on the plants, they can't jump. They're just kind of stuck there, and I would just go and pick all these grasshoppers. But it was those experiences in what is Valhalla Park that were really seminal to me. And after the war, we moved to London, Ontario, and I was going through puberty, but I was too terrified to ask any of the white girls out, and there weren't many Japanese girls, so I was really stuck, you know. You go around horny all the time and you don't know what to do. So my magic place that rescued me was a swamp or a bog that was near our house. And I can tell you, this is a truly magical place. And today, that magical swamp for me is entombed by asphalt and concrete. It's a gigantic shopping mall. And I just wonder about our children and where they find the kind of inspiration that I did when I was a boy. As more and more of us rush to the cities for opportunities, we become more and more urban, and we haven't designed our cities really to include nature. That's why an initiative like an urban national park is such a big thing. I think one of the problems is that we revel in our own cleverness and ingenuity. Today I was on a panel where one of the people talking about climate change said, oh yeah, but you know, there's been a real revolution in communication. You can go to the poorest village in Africa and they've all got cell phones, as this is kind of an indication that through information we're going to change the way that we live. But I said, but this is really a celebration of how clever we are and our technology. When television became a very big part of our lives, we used to call it the boob tube. And we're trying to keep the television shut down because it distracted. And then, of course, we started to get computers and the internet and laptops. And then, oh my God, we got iPods and iPads. And we love these things.
There's a mantra that is in the Nature Principle, the second book. And the mantra, among other mantras, is the more high-tech our lives become, the more nature we need. Too often parents get lectured, kids get lectured, oh, technology is terrible, letting your kids watch TV is terrible, you know, get them up off that couch. And then the next question is, and then they would do what? You know, they're growing up in neighborhoods that either the urban design is so bad that there's no place to go for a hike or a walk or touch nature, or even if there is greenery there. I don't know about Canada, but the United States, the covenants and restrictions that cover most communities, neighborhoods built in the last 30 years, 35 years, just try to put up a basketball hoop in some of these new suburban neighborhoods, let alone let the kids build a tree house or a fort. Not going to happen. One woman told me her community association outlawed chalk drawing on the sidewalks, which leads to cocaine addiction. You know, we've literally put up so many, including litigious legal barriers. Right. I mean, people are just scared. They're scared of strangers, and they're scared of strange lawyers. Much of that fear is created by my own profession of journalism. If you look at the actual statistics on stranger danger, you'll see that it's a relatively very small number. One is too many, but it's a very small number of stranger abductions. And it's actually been going down for 30 years. What's been going up is the 24-hour news cycle and the constant, I mean, we are being conditioned to live in a state of fear. You know, in San Diego, where I'm from, there's a survey done of inner city kids, and they found that 90% of those kids did not know how to swim, 95% had never been in a boat, and 36% had never been to the ocean. They're less than 20 minutes away. In San Diego, resort city. This is common all over. One of the things that the Sierra Club has done is they have a volunteer program where they go into urban neighborhoods, and the first thing they do is put backpacks on the kids, and they take a 5-mile hike in their own neighborhood, and they look for nature. And they find it. Now, it's not Yosemite, but it's, you know, it can be an alleyway that's overgrown, or grass in the cracks, and the insects that live there. And you talk a lot, David, about insects in urban areas and the magic of that. I tell the story sometimes of a guy named Juan Martinez, who is from South Central LA, who was headed for gangs, et cetera. I now work with him. He's the head of something called the Natural Leaders Initiative for the Children in Nature Network, which is a nonprofit that grew out of Last Child. He grew up, he was right on the edge of going full bore into gangs. And still looks like sometimes he still looks like he's got a girlfriend now, so he's cleaned up his act. But he has the hat, the baseball hat, and the big baggy chinos and all of that. He was in high school and he got in trouble, and the principal for some reason gave him a choice between being kicked out and joining the Eco Club. And he didn't want to join the Eco Club because that's all the nerds were. But he went ahead and did it, being a practical guy. And at first he really resisted it. And then the teacher had a project where they were all going to grow a plant, but they had to choose the plant. So one, yeah, I never thought of that. Pretty good. He didn't choose that one. He actually chose the plant that his mother would plant, having broken up the cement stoop behind their house and their back door. She broke the stoop open and planted chili plants there for their chili that she brought from Mexico. And so he says, I'm going to grow that plant. So he grew that plant, and then he took it home to her with the greatest pride to show her that he could give life to. Later, the Eco Club went to the Grand Tetons. And in the Grand Tetons, his life was forever changed. Absolutely. Now, it's often said one trip won't do it. Well, it's true, but sometimes it does. And it did for him. He spent the next few years volunteering in the Tetons, back and forth to South Central LA. Always looked the same, never changed his getup. And I write about him in the Nature Principle. He said that he realized over time when he would come back to South Central, he realized he was starting to hate his own neighborhood, his own home. And he didn't like that. So he dealt with that. He says nature isn't just in the Tetons. It's a home too. And so he's now spending about equal time going to the Tetons, organizing young leaders for the Children of Nature movement, and working with his homeboys, as he calls them, in his own neighborhood to green South Central LA.
The real lessons that we have to get across to make that reconnection are how to deal with time and to show interconnectedness of everything so that whatever we do has consequences that ripple out very far, and that we are utterly dependent on nature. So those 3 points really have to be made. We are a very impatient animal. We want to squeeze as much in our lives as we can. And we fail to leave any room for contemplation, just absorbing what's going on around us, just thinking. There's a wonderful book that came out in the I think it was the 60s, whose title was, Where Did You Go Out? What Did You Do? Nothing. And it was just all about childhood, that the author remembers his childhood, when you could lie on the grass and look up at the sky for hours and just daydream about the shape of the clouds and what was going on. And that today we see a child lying there for 5 minutes gazing up and we get, oh gosh, what's wrong with Johnny? He's lying out there, he's bored, we got to fill his time up. And we are so determined to chop our time up into small pieces and fill each of those moments. And one of the most important lessons we learn from nature needs time to reveal her secrets. Nature is unbelievably resilient and productive if you give her time.
Well, first, the research on this is long overdue. There's not enough of it, but there's enough to act. Some of the most important things have been ignored by research, partly because of where the money comes from. In Portland, Oregon right now, the urban park district, and this may be great for your huge new urban park, the urban park district in Portland, Oregon is working with physicians who are, in fact, writing recommendations to their patients to go out and spend time in nature, particularly pediatric folks. And when they get home, the park rangers, the park district literally calls the family on the phone and says, here's what we can do for you to fulfill your prescription. They go to the park rangers now acting as park health paraprofessionals, a new role, which is a really cool role, and they like it a lot, help them get their green exercise. They sign off on the prescription, send it back to the physician, and over time they're going to study the effect of this. The research, and I'll just go through this real quickly, shows enormous impact on kids with this symptoms of attention deficit disorder. Studies at the University of Illinois, just a little bit of contact with nature, those symptoms go down. I mean, some schools in the States, 30% of the boys are on Ritalin or some other stimulant. Jesus. Could that have something to do with the fact that we took nature away from them? We are animals, we are biological creatures, and when we forget that, we actually forget our own health.
This is the 50th anniversary this year of the beginning of the environmental movement. When Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, that book had an enormous impact. But it's every bit as relevant today because Rachel Carson really saw the challenge, which was to see us as a part of a much bigger system and dependent on it. And now I think Richard has shown, it's dependent in a very profound way in terms of our very health and well-being. The success of the movement was enormous in the first 30 years. We got the United Nations in 10 years. We had UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program. First environmental global conference was held in Stockholm in '72. We moved right up till 1992 when, well, even before that, I think the absolute height of the environmental movement was in 1988 when a guy ran for president of the United States and said, if you elect me, I'll be an environmental president. Do you remember that? Rich, do you know who it is?
George Bush?
Yes.
Oh, come on.
George H.W. Bush.
George the First.
George the First.
There wasn't a green bone in his body, but he said it because American people had put the environment at the top of the agenda. 1988, Margaret Thatcher was filmed picking up litter in Hyde Park, and she turned to the camera and said, well, I'm a greenie too. 1988, Brian Mulroney was reelected, and to show how committed he was to the environment, he appointed the hottest political star he had as the Minister of the Environment. I interviewed Lucien 3 months after he became Minister of the Environment. I said, Mr. Bouchard, what do you consider the most important environmental issue confronting Canadians today? And immediately he said, global warming.
Seriously.
I was impressed. I said, well, how important is it? And these are his exact words. It threatens the survival of our species. We have to act now. Right. 1988, a global conference on the environment, on the climate in Toronto. Ken Hare of the U of T called this meeting. 300 scientists, Stephen Lewis was a part of it. They were convinced that the evidence was in that humans were causing a phase of climate change. They issued a press release that said, well, global warming in those days represents a threat to humanity, second only to all-out nuclear war. And they said we must set a target of a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 15 years. Now, we've been going backwards ever since. We are fighting a dam at Site C on the Peace River. We won that 30 years ago, and now we're fighting the same battle. We are fighting against the proposal to drill for oil in Hecate Strait. We won that battle 35 years ago. So the fact that we're repeating the same thing means we haven't shifted the paradigm. Exactly. And so the big challenge now is we can't keep looking for market mechanisms and demanding a carbon tax and doing all of these economic things when it's all still elevating the economy above the very planet that we live on.
I think our number one problem, maybe even bigger than climate change, is that I'm convinced that most people, perhaps in North America, when they conjure up images of the future, the far future, I think most people see images that look a lot like Blade Runner, right, or Mad Max, or The Hunger Games, in which nature has been stripped from human life or so changed that it's unrecognizable and has been stripped from us along with our own humanity. If I'm right, and if those are the major dominant images of the future that we're carrying around in our heads, then we're in more trouble than we know. You know the saying, be careful what you wish for, you might just get it. Be careful what you imagine, you might just get it. Martin Luther King, and I think the civil rights movement, I think in some ways is a model for the future. Martin Luther King demonstrated and said in many ways that any movement, any culture will fail if it cannot paint a picture of a world that people will want to go to.
Right.
Others have said his speech was not called "I Have a Nightmare." The civil rights movement never stopped talking about the bad news, never stopped talking about lynchings, never stopped talking about the injustices. It talked about it even more. But what it did do is balance that with a dream, with an image of a future that people could see in their minds and wanted to go to. That image of the future, a nature-rich future, a better future, not just survival, but a great future. We have to be able to begin to paint that future. Let me give the example of family nature clubs. This started a couple years ago, 3 years ago, when a young father and teacher from Roanoke, Virginia, emailed me and said that he and his wife had been inspired by Last Child in the Woods and other things, and he and his wife started getting their kids out on weekends to the park. And one day the 5-year-old tugs on his father's pant leg and says, "Dad, how come we're the only family having this much fun?" So he started inviting other families. Today, they've created a club, and they have over 700 families on their email list. And what these families do is 4, 5, 10, 2 at a time families agree to show up at the park on Saturday and go for a walk, go for a hike, or garden, or sometimes do stream reclamation. There are now 126, I think, of these family nature clubs. Many of them have hundreds of families as members. What if in 5 years there were 5,000 of those, or 10,000, or 50,000? At that point, you'd be achieving with that, and I hope we can find a lot more tools like that, self-replicating social change. Not just more programs. More programs is important, but you don't have to wait for foundation funding to do this one. You can do it yourself, and you can do it now. You download a free toolkit from the Children Nature Network, and you go create your own. There's a guy named Doug Ptolemy. He's a botanist at the University of Delaware. He's written a book called Bringing Nature Home. And he makes the argument that if we're going to bring back or save or bring back the biodiversity we absolutely have to do, we've got to change all our yards. We can't just wait for the Amazon rainforest. We've got to transform our cities, starting with our yards. And by planting native species, which bring back the insects, which bring back a whole chain of life, et cetera. And beautiful yards can be created with native plants. My wife said, you know, next holiday season, instead of taking jam around to the neighbors, I could take them a little plant that would attract butterflies, and we could become a butterfly zone in our neighborhood. And Doug said, that's exactly what I have in mind. He says, what if it wasn't just your yard? What if it was the next door neighbor's yard that planted native species, and the one next, and the next, and the next, and 3 over, and maybe the next city, and the next city? You'd be essentially creating wildlife habitat zones on private land. And eventually, if you did it enough, we could call this the homegrown national park.
That's fantastic.
I think that's a great idea. So what if we began to think about our perception of nature that way, of not only what we can do in our yard, but how it can fit into something great and grand. Think of the power that kids would feel if they felt like they were bringing back butterfly migration routes and helping create a national or international homegrown park.